The desert had a way of swallowing sound, leaving only the faint hiss of wind across stone and the crunch of boots on gravel. Caleb Whitaker knew this silence well. It had been his companion on long trails, in empty plains, and now here, in the broken wastes of the Arizona Territory. Still, even he felt a shiver of unease in its endlessness. The morning had begun with disaster. His Mustang, a dun-colored beast named Dusty, had spooked at the cry of a distant coyote and bolted during the night. Caleb had woken to the sight of its hindquarters disappearing beyond the mesquite, saddle and gear still strapped on its back. By the time he shook off sleep and gave chase, the horse was a mile gone, leaving him on foot with nothing but his revolver, canteen, and the clothes he wore. That was hours ago. Now, under a pitiless sun, he trudged across the red earth, his eyes fixed on the tracks that pointed the way. Dusty had been his companion for 3 hard years, his strength, his transport, his chance of survival out here. Without him, Caleb was as good as dead. The tracks weren't hard to follow at first. The horse's hooves had dug deep crescents into the sandy wash, easy to spot even through the glare. But as the day wore on, heat shimmered across the land, and the trail bent toward rougher ground where rocks broke the surface. Caleb had to crouch low, studying every displaced pebble and faint scrape against the stone. Sweat slicked his brow and stung his eyes. He pulled his hat low, but the brim offered little relief. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth despite the careful sips he rationed from his canteen. He had maybe a day's worth of water left too, if he was sparing. "Damn fool horse," he muttered, though his voice lacked anger. Dusty wasn't to blame. Out here, anything could spook a mount, the cry of a hawk, the scent of a cougar, even a sudden dream. Caleb knew he'd grown careless, letting his guard down when he should have been alert. The desert stretched around him in every direction, mesas painted with ochre and shadow, arroyos like scars across the land, and the far-off ridges blurred by heat. Not a tree tall enough to cast real shade. Not a stream or trickle of water he could see. Just the steady, merciless expanse. As he walked, Caleb thought of other men who had vanished in places like this. He had heard stories around campfires. Prospectors found years later as sun-bleached bones, cowhands swallowed by sandstorms, drifters who simply wandered too far and were never seen again. The desert was a graveyard for the unwary, and right now, he was flirting with the same fate. But he pressed on because there was nothing else to do. Every step kept him tethered to Dusty's trail. Without that horse, he couldn't reach the next settlement, couldn't cross the miles of empty land. The bond between man and beast wasn't sentimental. It was survival. By midday, his legs burned with fatigue. He paused in the thin shadow of a boulder, crouching to study the tracks again. Dusty's gait had slowed here. Caleb could tell by the spacing of the hoof prints. The Mustang was tired, maybe thirsty, maybe even waiting somewhere ahead. That thought gave him strength. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and let his mind drift briefly, unwillingly, to the past. He had been many things, soldier, drifter, ranch hand, but the trail had been his truest calling. It asked nothing and gave nothing, save for the chance to keep moving. Yet even he had never felt so exposed, so alone as he did now. The wind shifted, carrying with it the dry scent of sagebrush and dust. Caleb listened, half hoping to hear the faint jingle of a bridle, the soft whicker of his horse somewhere nearby. But there was nothing, only silence. He exhaled slowly, forced his legs to move, and resumed the chase. Hours later, the tracks turned toward a narrow canyon, its mouth dark against the sunlit rock. Caleb felt his chest tighten. Shade lay in there, yes, but also uncertainty. Canyons could shelter water or ambush. He adjusted the revolver at his hip, the weight of it a cold comfort, and pressed forward. Every trail had its reckoning, he thought. He had followed horses before, tracked men, even tracked his own mistakes across the years. But this time felt different. Something waited in that canyon, though he couldn't have said what. All he knew was that if he wanted to survive, he had no choice but to follow. And so, with the heat pressing down and the desert holding its breath, Caleb stepped into the canyon's shadow unaware that his search for a runaway horse was about to lead him into the most fateful encounter of his life. The canyon swallowed him whole at first. Caleb welcomed the shift. The merciless sun was cut off by the sheer walls of red sandstone rising on either side, and the air grew cooler, tinged with the faint smell of dust and mineral. His boots crunched on the stony ground as he followed Dusty's trail deeper inside. The echo of each step magnified until it seemed someone else walked behind him. The Mustang's hoofprints were plain here, scattered in the loose sand that the canyon floor had collected over the years. Caleb crouched, brushing his fingertips across the indentations. The horse had been moving slower, more hesitant. Good. That meant Dusty hadn't bolted far, maybe even lingered nearby. Relief stirred in Caleb's chest, though he didn't allow himself to grow careless. He rose, scanning the walls. The canyon was narrow, twisting in a serpentine path, the sky reduced to a thin ribbon of light overhead. Places like this unsettled him. They were beautiful painted with layers of ochre, crimson, and pale white like the strokes of an artist's brush, but they offered too many blind corners. Too many places where a man could disappear forever. Then something caught his eye at a bend in the canyon. Just beyond the tracks of his horse, another trail appeared. Fainter, smaller, bare feet, pressed into the sand alongside the hoofprints. Caleb's brows knitted as he crouched again, studying the impressions. The toes were narrow, delicate. Not a man's feet, but a woman's, and recent perhaps only an hour old, if the dry air hadn't already blurred their edges. A cold prickle traveled down his spine. Now what in hell? He muttered under his breath. The desert was lonely country. Travelers came through in groups, or they came well armed. No one wandered barefoot through a canyon unless desperation drove them. But desperation didn't explain why the tracks had joined Dusty's path. Almost as if the horse and the stranger had crossed trails at the same moment, Caleb straightened, one hand resting on the grip of his Colt. His eyes scanned the shadows ahead, ears straining for any sound. The canyon answered with silence. He moved slowly, keeping close to the wall, his senses sharpened. Each bend he approached with caution, pausing to peer around before continuing. The tracks led him deeper, twisting through the narrowing gorge, until he began to notice other signs. A smear of dark brown against a rock, dried but not yet old. A faint drag mark in the sand, as though someone had stumbled or crawled. Blood. Caleb crouched again, touching the dried smear with a fingertip. He rubbed it between thumb and forefinger, grimacing. Human blood, no doubt about it. Whoever left those prints wasn't just wandering barefoot, they were hurt. Badly. A part of him whispered to turn back. The desert had rules, and one of the oldest was this: another man's misfortune could easily become your own. Injured strangers brought trouble, outlaws fleeing posses, soldiers deserting their posts, or worse, enemies from tribes who had no love for a white frontiersman like him. But another part of Caleb, the stubborn streak that had carried him through too many years of war and wandering, refused to walk away. He told himself it was about Dusty, that if his horse was caught up in whatever this was, he had no choice but to follow it through. Yet deep down, he knew it was more than that. The canyon tightened, walls pressing close enough that his shoulders almost brushed the stone. His footsteps grew quieter, instinctively lighter. Somewhere ahead, a faint sound broke the silence, a soft snort, unmistakable to his ears. A hoarse. Dusty. Relief surged, but it was short-lived. Alongside the familiar sound came another, a low, ragged groan. carried faintly on the canyon breeze. Caleb froze. His hand slid the revolver free, the weight of it steady in his grasp. He strained to listen, every muscle taut. The groan came again, softer this time, like someone fighting not to make a sound. He inched forward, rifleman's caution in every step, until he rounded the bend. There, in the dim shade beneath a sandstone outcrop, stood his Mustang head low, reins dragging in the sand. And at its feet lay the source of the tracks. A woman. Her skin was the color of copper burnished by the sun, her hair black and tangled, spilling across the stone. She wore a torn buckskin dress, stained dark around her waist where blood seeped through. Her side rose and fell in shallow breaths, and one arm was pressed tight against the wound as if to keep herself from breaking apart. Even in her weakness, her eyes found him. Dark, fierce, burning with suspicion and defiance. Caleb felt his pulse quicken. She wasn't just any woman. She was Apache Dot, and in that instant, standing there with his revolver half raised and his horse waiting behind her, he realized he had stumbled into a story larger than himself, one that could end in blood if he made the wrong move. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved. Caleb stood at the bend of the canyon, revolver drawn, staring at the wounded woman sprawled against the stone. His Mustang snorted softly beside her, the reins trailing in the dust as if it too sensed the strangeness of the moment. The woman's eyes, dark as midnight pools, locked onto his, fierce despite the weakness in her body. She wasn't begging. She wasn't pleading. She was warning. Caleb knew enough of the Apache to understand what those eyes said. One step closer, and you will regret it. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint rustle of wind across the canyon rim. Caleb felt sweat bead on the back of his neck. He had walked into plenty of dangerous situations in his time skirmishes, ambushes, bar fights that ended in drawn steel, but this felt different. It was quieter, sharper, like standing at the edge of a cliff you couldn't see the bottom of. He holstered the revolver slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. He crouched near Dusty, speaking softly to the horse to steady it, though the words were as much for himself as the animal. There now. Boy, easy. You found yourself a fine mess, haven't you? The horse flicked an ear but stayed put, its sides heaving from the heat. Caleb let out a breath, then turned his gaze back to the woman. She hadn't shifted an inch, though her breathing was shallow, each inhale ragged. Blood stained her buckskin dress around her waist, dark and wet. From the looks of it, the wound was no fresh scratch. It had been bleeding for hours. Caleb studied her with a practiced eye. He'd seen enough battlefield injuries during his soldiering years to know the difference between mortal wounds and those a man or woman might survive with help. This one was close to the line. Without care, she'd bleed out by nightfall. With it, she might live, and there lay the problem. Helping her meant risk. Big risk. If her people found him here, bent over her body with his hands bloodied, they'd never believe he'd been anything but her killer. And if white men stumbled across the scene, they'd see him aiding an Apache and decide he'd gone traitor. Either way, trouble was certain. But walking away, leaving her to die in the dust, that felt like something Caleb couldn't stomach. He shifted closer, moving slow so she could see his hands. He knelt just beyond her reach, keeping his voice low, calm, the way he might soothe a spooked colt. "You're hurt bad," he said. "If I don't patch that wound, you won't see another dawn. You understand me?" Her eyes narrowed, and though she said nothing, her hand twitched toward the stone beside her. Caleb followed the movement and spotted the crude knife lying half-hidden under her palm. Dull blade or not, she could still drive it into his ribs if he pressed too close. He raised his hands, palms open. "Easy. I ain't here to harm you. Just want my horse, but—" His gaze flicked to her wound again. "If I leave you like this, the buzzards'll finish you before sundown." That don't sit right with me." The woman's lips parted and a sound escaped faint, almost a whisper. It wasn't English. Caleb caught only fragments, soft syllables in Apache that he couldn't fully grasp. But her tone carried meaning enough: suspicion, defiance, the will of someone who refused to die quietly. Caleb exhaled through his nose. He dug into his saddlebag, still strapped to Dusty, and pulled out what little he had: a water flask, some cloth strips, a needle and thread wrapped in oilskin. The tools of a trailman who'd stitched his own skin more than once. When he held them up for her to see, her eyes flickered. Not trust, not yet, but something softer than defiance. "I'll clean the wound," Caleb said slowly, gesturing at her side. "Then bind it. That's all." He pointed to himself. "Help," then to her wound. "Stop blood." He wasn't sure how much she understood, but he kept his tone steady, even. For a moment, she said nothing. The canyon held its breath. Then, slowly, her hand eased off the knife. It was not surrender, more like a truce drawn in dust. Caleb moved closer, crouching beside her. Up close, the blood smelled coppery and sharp, already crusting where it had dried. He tore strips from his own shirt, pressing them against the wound to stanch the bleeding. She winced, a low hiss escaping her lips, but did not push him away. "That's it," he muttered, voice low and steady. "Hold on now." He poured a trickle of water over the wound, washing away grit and sand. She gasped, body tensing, but her eyes never left his face, as if measuring every flicker of intent. Caleb kept his focus on the task, sewing the torn flesh with clumsy but practiced stitches, his hands steady from long years of necessity. By the time he finished binding the wound, sweat soaked his back. The woman's breathing was still shallow, but steadier. Her gaze had shifted, not trust, not yet, but no longer the sharp, cutting glare of an enemy. Caleb sat back on his heels, flexing stiff fingers. "There," he said, wiping his brow. "You'll live." For the first time, her lips shaped a word he understood. "Why?" Caleb looked at her, then out at the silent canyon. The truth was simple, though he doubted she'd believe it. Because it's the right thing to do. When the stitching was done and the blood bound tight beneath strips of torn cloth, Caleb sat back against the canyon wall. His breath came heavy, though it wasn't the heat alone that weighed on him. It was the choice he knew he'd made, even before his hands ever touched needle or thread. He hadn't walked away. He should have. Any man with sense would have left the Apache woman to her fate. He could have gathered Dusty's reins, turned his back, and told himself the desert had claimed another life, that it wasn't his burden. That would have been the safer path. The smarter one, but the safer path had never been Caleb Whitaker's way. He glanced at her again. She lay against the rock, eyes half shut, her chest rising in shallow breaths. The pain had stolen much of her fire, but even now there was steel in the set of her jaw. She was no fragile creature. She had fought, run, survived long enough to find his horse and long enough to catch his hands in the net of her fate. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse, a whisper sanded down by exhaustion. "Name," Caleb blinked, unsure he'd heard right. Then he realized she was asking his. "Caleb," he said. "Caleb Whitaker." He tapped his chest for clarity. "Caleb." Her lips shaped the sound, rough and uncertain. Then she touched her own chest. Nantanita. The name rolled from her tongue with quiet strength, though her body trembled beneath the effort. Caleb gave a slow nod, repeating it back as best he could. Nantanita. For a heartbeat, her eyes softened. Then they closed, her body sagging against the stone. Caleb let out a long sigh. He reached for his canteen, tilted it carefully, and let a thin stream of water wet her lips. She swallowed weakly, but enough to show she still clung to the thread of life. And there it was again, that gnawing weight in his gut, Helping her was not just kindness. It was dangerous. He thought of the settlements eastward, where fear of the Apache ran hotter than the desert sun. If a rancher or soldier found him with her, they'd brand him a traitor. Aiding the enemy. The law wouldn't wait to hear his explanation. Then he thought of the Apache themselves. They did not forgive trespass lightly, and here he was, kneeling over one of their women, his hands stained with her blood. If her people found them, he'd be judged guilty no matter what truth he spoke. Whichever side found him first, he was marked. Caleb leaned his head back against the stone, staring up at the thin ribbon of sky far above. The desert gave a man little, but it always gave him clarity. Choices here weren't blurred by comfort or law. They were sharp, immediate. Live or die, act or wither. He rubbed a hand over his face. He could leave her here, tell himself he'd done enough by stitching her wound. The desert would finish the rest, and he could ride out free of the burden. His conscience would ache, but he'd live. Yet when he looked at her again, at the way her chest rose and fell, each breath a stubborn refusal to surrender, he knew he wouldn't. The decision had already been made the moment he knelt beside her. Damn fool, he muttered at himself. He eased Dusty closer, tying the reins to a jut of stone. Then he laid out what supplies he had left: a strip of jerky, a scrap of bread gone hard from the trail, the small pouch of dried beans at the bottom of his bag. Barely enough for one man, let alone two. But it would have to do. The canyon wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and sage. Caleb narrowed his eyes. Somewhere beyond those walls, danger was moving. He could feel it. The kind of quiet before storm or gunfire. He didn't know who hunted her or why, but the blood trail and her flight told him enough. She hadn't stumbled here by chance. She'd been running, and now, by choosing to bind her wound, he had chosen to run with her. Caleb adjusted his hat, jaw tight. He'd lived by his own rules for years, and they'd never been written by another man's hand. If the world wanted to brand him a traitor for helping her, so be it. If her people wanted to paint him as an enemy, so be it. He wasn't about to let a woman bleed out in the dirt just to save his own hide. He leaned forward, speaking softly, though her eyes remained closed. Rest easy, Nantanita. You're safe for now. But in his gut, he knew the truth. Neither of them was safe anymore. The canyon grew darker as the sun dipped, shadows stretching long across the red stone. Caleb built a small fire in the lee of an outcrop, keeping it low so the smoke wouldn't climb high enough to betray their position. The flames licked at the kindling, throwing wavering light over the hollow of the canyon dot across from him. Nantanita stirred. She had slipped into an uneasy half-sleep after he stitched her wound, but now her eyes flickered open, glinting like embers in the firelight. She didn't move much. Pain kept her still, but her gaze never left him. Caleb tore a strip of jerky, chewed it slow, then broke a smaller piece and held it out. Food, he said plainly, gesturing toward her. Her eyes flicked from the meat to his face, suspicion sharp in every line of her expression. For a moment, Caleb thought she might refuse out of sheer pride. But then, with a small, stiff movement, she reached and took it, bringing it to her lips. Her fingers trembled. She bit into the jerky with effort, jaw working slowly as though each chew cost her strength. Caleb nodded. Good, you'll need it. Silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of fire and the restless snort of Dusty tethered nearby. Caleb kept his hands busy, cleaning his revolver, checking the chambers, sliding the cylinder back into place. His movements were deliberate, not meant to intimidate but to remind her and himself that danger still lingered. When he glanced back, he caught her watching him closely, not with fear but with calculation. Her eyes traced every motion, as if weighing whether the weapon might one day turn on her dot. He set the revolver down within easy reach and raised both hands slightly. "No harm," he said, his voice steady. He pointed to her wound. "Help," then to himself. "Friend." The word felt strange on his tongue. He didn't know if she understood, but the truth of it hung in the air. Nantanita studied him for a long while, then whispered something in Apache low, almost too soft to hear. Caleb caught none of the words, only the tone. Guarded, wary, yet not wholly hostile. "Wish I knew your tongue," he muttered. "Would make this a sight easier." She coughed, a shallow sound, and winced at the movement. After a pause, she lifted a trembling hand and pointed at him. "White soldier?" she asked in broken English, the words clipped, accented. Caleb froze. Memories flickered in the firelight, the blue coats, the rattle of rifles, the cries on battlefields where men fell in heaps. He had been a soldier once. He couldn't deny it. But he wasn't proud of what the uniform had made him do. "Was," he said quietly. "Not anymore." Her brow furrowed, doubt shadowing her face. She studied him as if peeling away layers, searching for truth in the set of his jaw, the lines around his eyes. Finally, she gave a short nod, though whether it meant belief or simply acknowledgement, Caleb couldn't tell. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of all that could not be said. Different tongues, different worlds, stitched together only by the thread of necessity. Caleb shifted, leaning back against the canyon wall. "You think I'd stitch you up just to put a bullet in you after?" he asked, almost to himself. "Don't make sense." Nantanita's gaze lingered on him. Slowly, she lowered her hand toward her knife still lying near her side. She picked it up, weighed it in her palm, then set it deliberately aside, just out of reach. A message clear enough. She still didn't trust him, not fully, but she was willing to let the night pass without blood. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Fair enough," he murmured. The fire burned lower, the canyon wind sighing like a restless spirit. Caleb tilted his hat down, pretending to rest, though every nerve stayed alert. Nantanita shifted only once more during the night, adjusting her position, her face tight with pain but her eyes still sharp, still watching. Trust had not been built, not yet. But something had shifted in those quiet hours by the fire. Not quite allies, not quite enemies. Something in between. A fragile truce, balanced on the edge of a knife. And in the desert, that sliver of trust might be the only thing keeping them both alive. The night passed without sleep. Caleb dozed in fits, head against the stone, hand never straying far from his revolver. Every sound the shuffle of Dusty's hooves, the crack of cooling rock. The low whistle of wind down the canyon walls snapped his eyes open again. When dawn came, pale light creeping down the sandstone, he stirred the embers of the fire and poured the last of his beans into the tin cup. The smell was faint, hardly enough to fill a man's belly, but food was food. Nantanita sat propped against the rock, her skin pale beneath its copper tone, lips tight from the pain. Still, her eyes watched everything. She accepted a share of the beans with stiff pride, eating slow, careful not to show weakness. Caleb chewed his portion in silence, but his ears were tuned to the canyon mouth. Something in his bones itched a sense he'd carried since soldiering. The kind of itch that meant danger wasn't far. By mid-morning, he had proof. A faint echo drifted down the gorge. Laughter. Men's laughter, rough and careless, bouncing off the stone like ghosts. Caleb stiffened, head tilting. The sound came again, followed by the clatter of hooves striking rock. Nantanita's eyes flashed open wide. Her whole body went rigid, one hand clutching the bandages at her side. She whispered something in Apache, low and sharp, the words like the hiss of a snake. Caleb couldn't understand, but he didn't need to. Her fear said enough. He rose slowly, dusting off his knees, and crept toward the bend in the canyon. Each step was careful, boots rolling on their edges to muffle the sound. He pressed himself against the rock, then leaned just enough to peer around the corner. They came single file down the canyon, rifles slung across their saddles, dust rising from their horses' hooves. Their hats were wide-brimmed, their coats dust-stained, but their faces carried an ugliness that had nothing to do with the desert. Caleb knew the type: bounty hunters. Men who lived off the misery of others, chasing coin wherever it fled. One of them, a scar-faced brute with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, lifted his canteen and took a swig before calling out to the others. "Trail's fresh. She can't be far. Hell, might already be buzzard meat if we're lucky." The others laughed, a harsh sound that scraped the canyon walls. Caleb's jaw tightened so they were hunting Nantamita. And they were close. Too close, he pulled back from the bend, forcing his face calm as he returned to the hollow where she waited. Her eyes locked on him, sharp despite the pain. "She didn't ask, she already knew. They're after you," he said, keeping his voice low. "3 of them, hunters." She whispered a word he didn't understand, then spat weakly into the dust. Her expression told him all he needed: hatred mixed with a deep, bitter fear. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. He could ride out now, take Dusty, and leave her to their mercy. Let the hunters do their work. That would spare him a fight, spare him the wrath of anyone who'd call him a traitor for siding with an Apache. But when he looked at her, at the raw defiance in her gaze, the refusal to bow even wounded his stomach turned at the thought. He hadn't patched her up just to deliver her into their hands. He crouched beside her, speaking quick and low. "We can't stay here. They'll find this fire. I'll hide you somewhere deeper in the rocks. Then I'll deal with them." Her brow furrowed. She shook her head faintly, murmuring something that might have been warning, might have been protest. Caleb cut her off with a sharp whisper. "You trust me or you die. Those are the choices." For a long moment, she searched his face, weighing him as carefully as she had the night before. At last, she gave a weak nod. Caleb slid an arm under her shoulders, lifting her gently. She gasped, teeth clenched against the pain, but she didn't fight him. He half carried, half dragged her to a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, a crack barely wide enough for her slender frame. He laid her there, tucked behind stone and shadow. "You stay quiet," he said firmly, "no matter what you hear." Her hand caught his wrist, surprisingly strong despite her weakness. "You die," she whispered, eyes fierce. Caleb allowed himself a grim smile. "Not today." He pulled his revolver, checked the chambers, and stepped back toward the bend where the hunters' voices echoed closer. His boots ground into the dust, his heart beat steady despite the fire in his blood. If they wanted her, they'd have to come through him first. The canyon funneled sound in strange ways. Caleb could hear the hunters' horses long before they came into view, hooves striking the stone like drumbeats, drawing nearer with each step. He crouched low against the rock, revolver in hand, thumb resting on the hammer. The cool steel felt steady, but his pulse thudded in his ears. 3 men, armed, mounted. He'd been outnumbered before, and lived, but the canyon was tight ground. There would be no slipping away unseen, no clever escape if his first move failed. The laughter came again, echoing harsh off the stone. Then the hunters rounded the bend, just 30 yards off. Their leader, the scar-faced man Caleb had spotted before reined in his horse, squinting ahead. His eyes landed on the faint wisp of smoke rising from Caleb's fire pit. "Well, well," he drawled. "Looks like someone's been camping where they don't belong." The other 2 chuckled, shifting in their saddles. One carried a carbine across his lap, the other twirled a lariat as if eager to snare prey. Caleb stepped into view. Slowly, deliberately. Dust clung to his boots, his hat brim low, his revolver loose in his hand but ready. "Morning, gents," he said evenly. Can't say I expected company. The scar-faced hunter leaned forward in his saddle, eyes narrowing. You alone out here, stranger? Caleb gave a lazy shrug. Just me and my horse. Lost him last night, found him this morning. Trail does strange things sometimes. The man's grin spread, cruel and sharp. Funny thing? We're trailing someone too. Apache woman. Took a bullet yesterday but slippery as a snake. You wouldn't happen to see her, would you? Caleb felt the weight of the lie settle before he spoke it. Can't say I have. Been chasing my horse, not women. One of the others spat into the dust. Don't play dumb. Tracks lead right through here. Bare feet, blood. She's close, I can smell her. Scarface chuckled, but his eyes never left Caleb. Tell you what. You step aside, let us look around. Won't take long. Caleb's grip tightened on the revolver. His jaw worked as he weighed the cost of the next words. If he let them search, they'd find Nantanita tucked in the crevice, weak but alive. If he refused, the canyon would run red. He spat in the dust, a deliberate echo of their own disdain. Ain't no one here but me. You'll ride on if you've got sense. The lariat twirler barked a laugh. You hearing this, Harlan? Fella thinks he can tell us where we can ride. Scarface Harlan smiled thinly. I'm hearing it, and I don't like it. The carbine came up, slow but sure. Caleb didn't wait. His revolver cracked, the shot thunderous in the canyon. The carbine man toppled backward, rifle clattering from his hands as his horse screamed and reared. Chaos erupted. The lariat swung his rope, trying to wheel his mount around, but Caleb fired again. The bullet grazing the man's shoulder and spinning him in the saddle. The rope dropped uselessly to the ground. Harlan cursed, drawing his pistol with quick, practiced hands. His horse lunged forward, closing the gap. Caleb dove sideways, rolling behind a boulder as bullets sparked off the stone. Dust choked the air, acrid and hot. He popped up, fired 2 shots, then ducked again. One bullet struck Harlan's horse in the leg. The beast screamed, collapsing sideways, pinning its rider beneath. Harlan roared, trapped but still firing from the ground. Muzzle flashes lighting the dust. Caleb pressed his back to the stone, breathing hard. Counting the chambers left in his revolver. 2, maybe enough. He leaned out, aimed careful, and fired once. The lariat man, who had been fumbling for his dropped rope, pitched sideways out of the saddle and hit the ground with a grunt. The last bullet he saved for Harlan. The scar-faced hunter snarled, dragging himself from under his wounded horse, pistol raised. Caleb's revolver barked. The shot took Harlan clean in the chest. He staggered, eyes wide with disbelief, then crumpled in the dust. Silence fell, heavy and ringing in Caleb's ears. Smoke curled from his revolver, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the canyon air. The only sounds were the ragged breaths of the surviving horse and the distant cry of a hawk. Circling high above, Caleb stood slowly, holstering his weapon. His body hummed with adrenaline, but his face was stone. He stepped over Harlan's corpse, nudging the pistol from the man's slack hand, and scanned the canyon. No more voices. No more laughter. It was done. But as he turned back toward the crevice where Nantanita hid, Caleb knew the fight had only begun. 3 dead men in a canyon would not go unnoticed. Someone had hired them, and that someone would want answers. And Caleb had just made himself part of the story, whether he liked it or not. When the last echo of gunfire died, the canyon was still again. Smoke drifted upward, curling into the hard blue sky. Caleb stood for a moment in that silence, listening for hooves, for shouts, for anything that might signal more men coming. Nothing. Only the wind. He wiped the back of his hand across his brow, smearing sweat and grit. 3 men lay dead in the dust, their bodies sprawled among the hoof prints of their horses. Caleb knew he ought to feel relief, but instead he felt the same gnawing unease that had stalked him since the night before. Men like these didn't ride alone. Someone had sent them. Someone with reason to want the Apache woman silenced, Dusty Wickard pulling against his reins. Caleb muttered a low word of comfort as he walked past the corpses, his boots crunching on the gravel. He knelt at the crevice where he had hidden her. "Nantanita," he called softly. "It's done. You can come out." For a heartbeat, there was only stillness. Then her face appeared, pale in the shadow. Her eyes scanned the canyon, widening at the sight of the bodies. Slowly she crawled forward, wincing with every movement. Caleb helped her upright, his arm firm around her shoulders. "You killed them," she whispered in halting English, her tone neither grateful nor horrified, but something heavier. A statement. "They weren't the kind to talk things through," Caleb answered, his voice flat. She looked at him a long while, as if measuring the shape of his soul. Then she said, "They come again. More men, always more." Caleb frowned. "Why? What do they want with you?" Her gaze dropped to the ground, shadow falling over her face. She hesitated, her lips pressing tight, as though speaking the truth might cut deeper than the bullet wound. Finally, she drew a breath. "They want what I carry," she said. Caleb's brow furrowed. "Carry? You mean money? Gold?" Her head shook fiercely. "No gold, spirit." She tapped her chest. "My people's spirit." He stared at her, not understanding. "You'll have to do better than that." Nantanita closed her eyes, gathering strength. When she opened them again, there was fire there, dimmed by pain but unbroken. "I am daughter of a shaman, keeper of words, sacred ways, old songs. My father teach me. He die. Now I carry." Caleb's breath caught. He had heard whispers, even among white soldiers, of Apache shamans who knew secrets older than the desert itself, rituals, cures, power drawn from the land. To her people, such a role would be priceless. To outsiders, men greedy for control, it would be worth killing for. She nodded at the corpses. "Those men. They hunt me for white masters. They want me speak secrets, show ways. They twist them. Turn spirit to gold. Make war with it." The weight of her words sank into him like lead. She wasn't just a fugitive, some unlucky soul caught in crossfire. She was the bearer of something greater, a living vessel of knowledge others sought to steal. Caleb scrubbed a hand over his jaw, the stubble rasping beneath his palm. "So that's it. You're not just running for your life, you're running for your people's soul." Her eyes met his, dark and steady. "Yes." He leaned back, staring at the canyon wall as the truth settled in his bones. By stitching her wound, by firing on those hunters, he had tied himself to her fate. He could no longer claim ignorance or neutrality. He was part of it now, whether he wanted to be or not. For a long while, neither spoke. The desert stretched silent around them, vast and merciless. Finally, Caleb broke the stillness. "If what you're saying is true, they won't stop. More men will come. Maybe soldiers may be worse." He looked her square in the eyes. "You got a plan? A place to run?" Nantanita's lips pressed into a thin line. "I go to mountains. To my people. They hide me, keep me safe. But I am weak now. Alone I not reach them." Caleb sighed, the sound heavy as stone. He knew what she was asking, even if she didn't speak it outright. She wanted him to take her there, across miles of hostile desert, through the gauntlet of whoever else might be chasing her. He looked at the 3 dead men again, their blood soaking into the sand. He thought of the smoke that might already be rising, signaling more riders' dot. Then he looked back at her. "Reckon I've already chosen my road," he muttered. "No sense pretending otherwise." Her eyes softened just a fraction. a glimmer of something close to trust flickering there. Caleb rose, offered her his hand, and pulled her gently to her feet. "Come on, Nantanita. We've got a long trail ahead. And if what you say is true—" He glanced back at the canyon, jaw tight. "Then we're not just running from death. We're running towards something bigger." The desert wind rose, sweeping dust across the bodies of the dead. Somewhere in that sound, Caleb thought he heard the faint whisper of drums, echoes of a struggle older than him, older than all of them, and he knew his life would never be the same again.